Hi everybody, Mr. C here, and today we're going to introduce the market model and we're going to learn about the law of demand. So let's get started. The market model is one of the most important models in the course. Essentially, imagine you were studying a great economic battle. Well, if you were going to study that great economic battle, you'd want to learn who the two participants were. And in this model, the two participants are going to be the buyer, also known as the consumer, and the seller, also known as the producer. And what we want to understand is the mindsets of the consumer and the producer. What makes them behave the way they behave? So the first thing you have to understand is that this model is largely psychological. It attempts to understand how the mindset of the consumer, when paired with or against the mindset of the producer, ultimately determines how much buyers and sellers pay for goods and how much goods are exchanged back and forth among the buyers and sellers. So let's get started. And let's start off with the consumer. The consumer's philosophy is called demand. And demand is very simple. You've probably heard of it before, but the definition is actually simple and complex at the same time. Demand, henceforth abbreviated capital D, is very simply the quantity, henceforth abbreviated capital Q in economics, of a specific good or service that consumers are, and here's two really important words, willing and able to buy at various prices, henceforth abbreviated capital P for price. Demand is the quantity of a good or service that consumers are willing and able to buy at various prices. It's not what customers want. I want a Ferrari, but sadly the Ferrari people don't count Mr. C when trying to determine the demand for their product. Because while I like Ferraris and I'm willing to buy one, unfortunately on a teacher's salary, I'm not able. I can't afford it. Likely, the Yugo people, it's a cheap car that was made in the 80s and 90s, don't count Mr. Sioka or didn't count Mr. Sioka as part of the demand for their product. Even though I can afford a Yugo, I really didn't like their cars very much and didn't think they were good cars. Thus, while I was able to buy it, I was unwilling. To be part of a demand, you have to meet those two criteria. You have to be willing to buy it. You got to want it. And you have to be able to pay for it to be counted as the demand. Now, demand is essentially a relationship between two things: the price of the good and the quantity of the good. And common sense tells us that consumers like low prices. And that brings us to what we call the law of demand. And the law of demand is really simple. The law of demand says when the price of a good or service goes down, the quantity that customers are willing and able to buy, the quantity demanded, goes up. Notice I didn't say demand goes up. I said quantity goes up. So when price goes down, the quantity customers are willing and able to buy, the quantity demanded, goes up. And inversely, the opposite is true. As the price of a good or service goes up, the quantity that customers are willing and able to buy goes down. So to summarize, the law of demand says that price and quantity demanded are inversely related. When one goes up, the other goes down, and vice versa. Well, there's two reasons that economists have found this inverse relationship between price and the quantity of customers willing and able to buy. And I know what you're sitting there. You're saying, yeah, the first one's common sense. Well, that's probably true, but as scientists, we just can't apply common sense. We have to find out the reason why. And the two primary reasons that economists have found this inverse relationship from the customer's perspective are number one, what we call the substitution effect. I'll abbreviate the sub effect. And the substitution effect says when the price of Coca-Cola goes down, the quantity of Coca-Cola that customers are going to be willing and able to buy will go up. Okay, isn't that just the law of demand? Yes, but we're explaining why it takes place. And the reason why the people are more willing and able to buy Coca-Cola when its price goes down is because they substitute it for other types of cola, perhaps Pepsi. And when the price of Coca-Cola goes up, the quantity of Coca-Cola that people buy goes down for the same reason. They start substituting something else for the relatively more expensive Coca-Cola, probably Pepsi. Reason number two is what economists call the income effect. And the income effect basically says that when the price of a good or service goes down, the purchasing power of the income you earn, what economists call your real income, your income adjusted after price changes, goes up. So if the price of something goes down and you were making $1,000 a week, that $1,000 now has more real purchasing power for you. Thus, you're likely to buy more of those goods and services. And the opposite is true. When the price of a good or service goes up, you have less real purchasing power with your existing income. Thus, you become less willing and able to buy certain goods and services. So the two main reasons why we see this inverse relationship between price and quantity from the customer's perspective are the substitution effect and the income effect. Now let's see it in action. I want you to imagine that I was selling chocolate bars, and I've done this exercise in my classrooms before, and I say, okay, here's the deal. I'm going to start calling out prices. If you're willing and able to buy a chocolate bar at that price, raise your hand. And let's say I start off at $1, and my students say, yeah, $1's a lot of money, Mr. C, and we don't have $1, so no, we don't want to buy any of your chocolate bars. Maybe they have $1 and they just ate lunch, or they want one, but they don't have $1. But either way, at $1, my students wouldn't be willing to buy a chocolate bar. But let's say I lower the price to 80 cents and all of a sudden, students start raising their hands and they're willing and able to buy 100 chocolate bars. I lower the price again. And not only do the students who would have paid 80 cents, but when I lower the price to 60 cents, those 100 students plus 100 more want to buy chocolate bars. And if I lower the price to 40 cents, I would have sold the same 200 chocolate bars and even more. So maybe now we're up to 300 chocolate bars. And likely if I lower the price all the way to 20 cents, maybe I would have sold 400 chocolate bars. This is what's known as a demand schedule. It's known as a demand schedule. This is the demand for chocolate bars in Mr. Sioka's school. And notice the law of demand holds. As the price of chocolate bars went down, the quantity that my students were willing and able to buy, the quantity demanded, went up. Now, generally, we don't work with schedules when we're dealing with economics. We prefer to work with graphs because graphs allow us to see a whole lot more data in a real compact area and allows us to analyze it just a little bit better. So let me change my stylus to red, and let's assume that the price was $1. We're always going to put price on the vertical axis. Well, I would have sold no chocolate bars. Then if the price went to 80 cents, my customers would have been willing and able to buy 100 chocolate bars, so I'll label that point right there. If the price went to 60 cents, my students would have been willing and able to buy 200 chocolate bars. Notice I'm not drawing this to scale, but I'll do the best I can. When the price goes to 40 cents, students would have been able to buy, and willing and able to buy 300. And when the price drops all the way to 20 cents, students were willing and able to buy 400 chocolate bars. And I'll put 500 on the graph, but didn't come into play here. Notice when I connect the dots, what happens? So, connect the dots there, and there, and there, and there. We have a downward sloping demand curve. This is the demand curve. And the demand curve, because of the inverse relationship between price and quantity demanded, always slopes down. Notice, as price went down from $1 to 80 to 60 to 40, etc., the corresponding quantity went up. Now, sometimes these demand curves will be relatively linear, like the one I've drawn here, and sometimes the demand curves will in fact be curved. But more often than not, when we draw it, we're going to draw it in a linear fashion because we just simply want to illustrate the idea that when price goes up, from the customer's perspective, quantity goes down. And when price goes down, the quantity the customer's willing and able to buy, their state of mind, doesn't mean they'll actually buy more, doesn't mean there'll be one for them to buy, it just means they're more willing and able to buy when price goes down. So from now on, whenever we draw a demand curve, we're actually going to draw it relatively simply. Here's how we're going to draw it, very abstractly. We're going to make our vertical axis price, and I'm going to label it with the P, no more, no less. And I'm going to draw my horizontal axis, and I'm going to label it with the Q for quantity. And I'm going to draw a downward sloping demand curve. And I'll draw it as a straight line, and I'll label it D. That's all I have to do from now on, and all you have to do as well, to label those demand curves. Thus, we see we have a vertical price axis, a horizontal quantity axis, and a downward sloping demand curve. Now, let's see what happens when we want to illustrate a change in price. Very simply, change in price, movement along the demand curve. So, I have right here, notice, P1. And with P1, if I want to find the corresponding quantity that customers are willing and able to buy, I go over to my demand curve and down to the quantity axis. If I want to find how much customers are willing and able to buy when price goes down, I put P2 below it, and I can find the corresponding quantity on my demand curve straight down. Notice, when price goes down, the quantity that customers are willing and able to buy increased. Law of demand. And on this graph, I've illustrated an increase in price. I have P1 corresponding to Q1, and I have P2 over and down corresponding to Q2. Notice here, when price goes up, the quantity that customers were willing and able to buy increase. Change in price, movement along the demand curve. Change in some factor other than price, well, we're going to see what happens there in our next lesson. See you next lesson. Bye-bye.